There we go.
Nice.
All right, I'm here in air quotes with John Colapinto. I was thinking about you this morning as I woke up, which is not a thing I say to many men, John. But and I thought, interestingly, you're at or near, certainly in the top 5 on the list of people I don't know well, but feel a lot of affection toward. And like, I feel like we would be good buddies if we happened to live in the same town.
I feel totally the same way. The first time I met you. Yeah, no, it's so funny. I mean, I can't even remember exactly how we met, but it was years ago. But I was like, I just know this guy. I've known him either in a prior life, or
that's the feeling. Yeah.
Or he's like somebody I knew, and I'm sort of not drawing the connect. But anyway, yes,
right.
No, it is interesting. That's
awesome. I think when we met was that night. It was shortly after Sex at Dawn came out. I was riding the wave and I was in New York doing some media thing. And our mutual friend, Tony Paratet, said, do you mind if I bring John Colapinto to have drinks with us tonight? And I was like, the New Yorker guy? Fuck yeah, of course. And you showed up, and we were somewhere in the like East Village, I think. And we were in a booth, I remember, like a corner table, and you went to the bathroom, and the three of us were having a great time.
This is the best prank I've ever pulled. I'm so glad it's now going to be semi-famous. Or actually famous. I mean, it would be super famous if this was like Jimmy.
This is the first time I met you. And so you go to the bathroom, and we're probably 2 or 3 cocktails into the evening, and you come back with 2 beautiful young women under each arm. And you're like, hey girls, I just wanted to meet my friend Chris. And these women are laughing. And I was like, this dude is a player. Holy shit. I mean, Hugh Hefner wouldn't have pulled that off.
It was so amazing. And you know, to set that up even a little bit more, to sort of make us a little more guilty in the eyes of maybe the female section of the audience, the 3 of us 3 guys, have been sort of talking about women. You know, we've been just talking about what it's like. And, you know, I won't go further than that, but that's what we've been talking about. So I thought it would be very funny to come wandering back in with these ladies. And they were such incredibly good sports, because I came out of the bathroom and I saw these 2 very attractive girls there. And I probably did need to be slightly drunk for this, although possibly not, which is another problem of mine. But anyway, I walked up to them and I said, I just basically explained the situation. I said, it would be the most incredible thing if I could come around the corner with you 2 under my arms. And they knew exactly what it was about. Like, they wanted to do it. They thought it was hilarious. Yeah. Fuck, that was awesome. That was so glad you reminded me of it. So
that wasn't like the 4th or 5th couple of women that you'd approach with this?
No, it was that. Lo and behold, it worked first time out. First stroke. These were my first, no rejections before that.
That's the kind of thing, if it hadn't worked, you probably wouldn't have gone looking for another group. Yeah,
totally. And I wouldn't have told you guys. I wouldn't have come back around the corner alone and said, hey guys, you wouldn't believe the joke that didn't work. I just got humiliated by 2 young women. Definitely not.
Exactly.
Oh, that went down in his. I don't think Tony's ever gotten over it, because he lives his life to be able to do that. And I do hope that he'll listen to this podcast. He's actually divorced, so he does it virtually every night for real. So what am I talking about?
And he's walking around with a fucking smoking jacket, looking like he just came out of an opium den half the time. I mean, if that guy's he doesn't have the moves, he's in the wrong town. Maybe he needs to be in Shanghai or something.
That's right. Yeah. That's right. Wonderful guy. Love Tony, and love him all the more for having introduced you and me. It's awesome.
I had a kind of a similar experience once. I was in Portugal with a friend of mine. It was his 30th birthday. And we were sitting in a cafe outside. And I was basically complaining about how women in Portugal weren't as attractive as women in Spain, which is where I had been living for a long time. And I had just moved to Portugal. And this beautiful woman walked by, and he said, like, oh my God, look at her. And I said, yeah, wow, but she's probably not Portuguese. She's like Brazilian or something. And he's like, dude, invite her to have a drink with us. It's my birthday. And I was like, you invite her. It's like, I don't speak Portuguese. And he said, oh no, you invite her. Anyway, long story, but I went up to her and I was like, hey, here's the situation. It's my buddy's 30th birthday, and you're the most beautiful woman we've seen in Portugal in 2 days or whatever it was. And she laughed and she was like, well, I can't now, but I could meet you later at the restaurant at like 8 o'clock in this bar. And I was like, seriously? She said, yeah. So she left, and I walked back to the table, and my friend's like, oh, you got shot down. And I was like, well, actually, she's gonna meet us later. So she came later, and she was dressed so sexy. And and I spent the next hour trying to figure out if she was a prostitute or not.
Yes.
And I didn't know, and I couldn't. So I was trying to be like, open, like I'm not judging, like, you know what I mean? Like, if how much would it cost for you to be with my friend, was basically what I was thinking, but I couldn't really ask, because if she wasn't a prostitute, that would have been horribly insulting, right? And I didn't want to insult her. We were having a nice time. She was really nice. So we just did this. I was the only one talking to her. My friend was scared. He was off, talking with other people. Anyway, turns out we ended up being friends. And later she told me, she's like, I love it when guys don't know if I'm a prostitute or not. That turns me on so much. So I just wanted to keep you right there on the ledge. and I was getting off on that, on your confusion so much.
Oh, that's funny as hell.
Wow.
That's amazing. Yeah. I'm such a babe in the woods. I never that someone could be a prostitute is like the last thing that's going to occur to me. Like, I'm just pathetic. Like, I don't know how long I can live in this city of escorts. I've got a feeling 80% of the very beautiful women you see in the best restaurants here are in fact escorts. And I've actually had reason to learn that may actually be true, for reasons that I can't actually go into publicly, but nothing involving me being a customer, trust me.
It's all
just
about
through
Tony.
Some friends.
It's just Tony and the hookers. Yeah.
That I can't speak to. I think Tony, Tony doesn't have to pay for it, Tone. No, but they're under our noses here and perhaps there. And I never know it. I never realize it. Yeah. I mean, I could be very, very deep into a situation if I was single, where I would suddenly be told, to break out the wallet. And I'd be like, well, you're kidding. I thought you just thought I was awesome.
Yeah.
I don't know. I just don't. And I think on some fundamental level, this is the Puritan in me. I've been accused lately or recently by someone of being like bizarrely Puritan and reactionary. I'm not down with the idea of being able to be a prostitute. I think it's I'm not trying to be anti-sex worker. It's just that I can't. To me, it seems like the hardest job in the world, simply because, well, you have to involve yourself with someone else's body. So I guess I put it on a par maybe with nursing or something, or being a physiotherapist, like having to involve yourself with someone else's sweat and odors. It's heroic. I can never believe anyone does it. I guess that's the bottom line.
Well, I mean, I think you're right to equate it with nursing or massage therapist or,
yes,
a veterinarian. I mean, a lot of people, I think everyone has individual variation in terms of how repulsive that stuff is. Some people don't mind it at all. Some people, I interviewed, do you know who Nina Hartley is? The porn star.
I know the name. Why do I know that? I'm not. Yeah.
Porn star.
Is that an actress or something, Nina?
Yeah, she's like one of the biggest porn stars from the 70s.
And absolutely.
Right.
Yes.
And she was in Boogie Nights, playing herself in Boogie Nights.
Yep.
Yeah. Great movie. Holy cow.
Love it. Incredible.
Anyway, I interviewed her years ago on the podcast, and she told the story about how she got into porn through nursing. Because she was a nurse and she saw how much pain people were in, and she really enjoyed alleviating pain and giving pleasure to people. And she realized, like, a lot of the guys, who she was dealing with in the hospital, like, it would promote their healing and make them feel so much better to get a hand job or whatever. And she was like, I don't mind doing it. I'd like to do it. I would like making people feel better. That's why I became a nurse, And from there,
That's
she was
fascinating.
just like, well, I should just do this, for a living. And yeah, so I think, I mean, I'm like you in the respect that I'm also strangely naive about it. I think, like, kind of uh genetically something. First time I went to Bangkok, I was probably 27 or 28, and of course everyone knows Bangkok is world famous sex, and I was in a cafe, and there were like three or four young women at a table, and they kept looking at me and smiling and laughing and nudging each other and stuff. And I was just like, wow, like these women are really friendly here in Bangkok, and they must like white guys, and and it never occurred to me, and to this day, I've
Yes.
spent years in Thailand. I've never been with a Thai girl because I could never wrap my head around, like, if she secretly doesn't want to be doing this, it would make me feel so disgusting. I have no problem with money. I have no problem
That's great.
paying for things or recognizing
Yes.
the cultural, unfairness that I make this much money per day and she doesn't. And, I've got no problem, no judgment. I just don't know. I don't want to find myself in an intimate situation with someone who doesn't want to be there. That would make me feel
Wow,
like a
that's well put.
monster.
Yeah, no, that's amazing. That actually cuts amazingly to the heart of exactly why, and I've never phrased it that way to myself before, but why it does seem like a relationship I couldn't. I mean, I've never entered into it. Actually, it was when I was, oh, I can't tell that story because he might listen. I do have a friend, I'll just put it this way, that, and I'm not going to situate the city or even time of my life, but
It's Tony.
he was having a celebratory moment and I was out of our shared domicile. I came home early and there was an incredible looking young woman in our living room with sort of like a matte white makeup on her face and peroxided white hair and very dramatically painted eyes, very, very young, wearing very little clothing. And I came in and I didn't know where my friend was. I almost said his name, called out to him. He was upstairs. He came down just embarrassed out of his mind. He had been complaining he didn't have a girlfriend at that point, and lo and behold, the poor guy, thinking that I wasn't going to be home, had gone and hired a young lady to be with him, and he was just covered in confusion and mortification and
Mm.
so embarrassed, and I felt bad for him. But that's the closest that I've sort of come to that situation. Although I do then have to say that it was so funny because doing what I tend to do in any social situation, which is try to fall into a normal conversation, I sort of started to converse normally with this young girl. And I can't remember exactly, I don't know if I got her name, but anyway, it had to have been a week later that I was walking in this particular part of the city where there was a lot of these young women. And you're going to think this is made up. And I was with my girlfriend. And the girl, the very one, was shouted out to me, John, hi, John, because I had told her my name. Hi, John. And that also speaks to the fact that I got to say this girl was definitely underage and
Wow.
definitely inexperienced. I mean, what working girl would actually do
Mm.
that? So that
Right.
really spoke to the naivete that I absolutely know she had. And the girlfriend that I described as then is now my wife. And if she was here, she could corroborate this story, which sounds like it has to be bullshit. It literally happened. Hi, John. And Don was like, what the fuck?
Was
Anyway,
she all
that took some
peroxide?
explaining.
Was she wearing the whole
Oh, she
getup?
was in the whole, because she was working.
Oh.
Yeah, she was literally working. And the
Oh,
girls, yeah, I didn't
wow.
set that up as well as I could have. It's like it was a notorious part of the city I was living in, and they
Right.
were lined up where they lined up.
Right.
And yeah, no, she called out like, in all of her working girl friends were like kind of looking and see, and it was just a ridiculous moment. God, I don't know how we got here in the car. This is very tangentially speaking, Chris. I
Didn't
don't know if
take
anyone's ever
long,
said
did
that
it?
to you before.
Yeah, yeah. I've only been with a prostitute one. I mean, I've been, so there's one night I was in Amsterdam. This is a long time ago, probably after that trip to Thailand. I was in Amsterdam. I was alone. I hadn't been with a woman in 6 months or something. I was, crazed, testosterone. And I ate a hash brownie and I was walking around the red light district, and I was like, "Ah, I gotta just do this. Like, this is crazy. Like, these women, I know they're not victims. I know they're getting medical testing. I know they're choosing to do this. They're not heroin addicts, down on the Bowery or whatever. Like, if I'm ever gonna experience this, I should do this." So the first, I went to this Asian woman. Turns out she's from Thailand. And you go into the little room, there's the red lights, they're sitting in the window. You've been to Amsterdam, the red light district?
I have not actually, no, but I
Oh.
know, of course, the famous red light district. Sure.
So I go in there, and she tells me the price. It was like 50 euros. I'm like, okay. And then she says, I'll be right back. And she leaves the room, closes the curtains and everything, leaves the room. And so I'm just sort of sitting there on this bed, and she comes back in and she looks at me and she starts laughing. I said, "Why are you laughing?" And she says, "This is the first time you've done this, right?" I said, "Yeah. How do you know?" She said, "Well, you're still dressed. You're supposed to get undressed when I leave."
Oh,
I was
fantastic.
like, "Oh,
Fantastic.
fucked it up already." And then I'm like chatting with her about Thailand. "Oh, really? What part of Thailand are you from? Oh, do you like spicy food?" Oh. And then I see her face getting like, "All right, dude, you got like 15 minutes. I don't want to like meet your mother."
I got to tell you, that is all too close to exactly what would happen if I were ever to do this. And our listeners know that because they hear us talking to each other, and we talk in a similar style. And I would just definitely also be trying to make friends with her.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
God.
Because that's the model, right? Like I mean, I don't know. I don't want to be unfriendly. But anyway, so
Yeah,
I was with
no.
her, and then I left. I was with another one, and then a third one the same night. I just
Oh,
went, I was like, okay, let's go for it. And the third one was really interesting. The second one was not interesting. And the third one was a Dutch woman. And by now it's like 2 a.m. or something. And I start chatting with her, and she's totally into it. She's like, "You really want to know?" Like, because I was like, "So, do your family know you do this? And do you have a boyfriend? And does it complicate your life?" I'm basically doing a podcast with her, right? And she was
yep.
like, so we end up lying there in bed together like a married couple. And I apologized. I was like, "Hey, I don't want to take your time. I know time is money and all that." And she's like, "No, you're the last one of the night. After this, I'm just going home. This is relaxing. Let's hang out." I'm like massaging her back and chatting about her boyfriend and like what it's like, and if she knows other women from her high school and we must have lay there for at least an hour just talking. It was beautiful. It was great.
Yeah. Oh, that's amazing.
I don't
Yeah.
even know if we
Wow.
had sex. I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, at that point,
Yeah.
who
Right.
cares?
Hash brownie, third one of the night. I mean, who knows?
Yeah. Yeah.
Fantastic.
Anyway, I don't think
Wow.
I've ever told that story publicly before, but the hell
Oh,
with it.
good. I got a fresh story out of you. I also was listening to how you're not sure which stories you've told before, but yeah, maybe
Yeah.
that's a new one. Nice.
Who knows? My listeners will be like, "Dude, you've told that story 19 times. Last time it was 6." Anyway, John Colapinto, the first time you came to my awareness was the fantastic article that you wrote about the Pinaha people in the Amazon basin. And I don't know if you and I have ever really spoken about that. I feel like we always jump, like that's in the front of my mind, but we always jump into other stuff. So I'd like to just like plant a flag. I'd like to talk to you about the experience of going there and researching that and writing it,
Yeah.
because that article was so pivotal in my own education and in writing Sex at Dawn and like my sort of intellectual development. That was very important. And I also want to talk to you about, if you're willing, I mean, maybe you don't want to get into this stuff, but I feel like you're uniquely qualified to discuss the J.K. Rowling trans, I mean, because another book
Yeah.
you wrote was 10 years ahead of all this, at
Right.
least. So
Yeah.
those are two things I'd
No.
like to talk about, but everything else, God knows where we're going to get in this conversation.
Right. No, those are great things to talk about. I mean, it's fun. I mean, lately, I'm actually sort of in that old prostitute stage of the journalistic career where I seem to do nothing except talk to very interesting people about old stories that I did. So these UK filmmakers just had me talking about Bob Guccione because I did a profile of him for Rolling Stone years ago, shortly before he died. And I have been doing some stuff about As Nature Made Him, which is that kid that was sex changed in infancy, which we'll get to. And then the Peter Han, and that linguistic story does crop up an amazing amount. I mean, it's nice when you write a magazine story that could, just become fish wrap, but it doesn't quite. So people tend to remember that one. And I must now boast that I remember at the time, it was I was kind of new to this whole idea of them counting the number of clicks that a story got. But my editor phoned me very excitedly to say that it was just like off the graph, off the charts, the number of clicks, that more than any other story that it was getting, and so on. She also said that she would quit journalism if it didn't win a National Magazine Award. It didn't. And she's no longer at the New Yorker. So I don't know if that's a connection. No, she left for other reasons. That story was amazing. It took me, just to orientate your listeners if they're still with us. It was a story about a very remote tribe in the Amazon, very, very small numbers of them left, like just a few hundred, I think, or something. I mean, it was just a tiny number of them. And they had sort of withdrawn. Their whole sort of defining characteristic was sort of the degree to which they rejected anything cultural outside of their tribe. And that was sort of critical to why I was writing the story about a specific aspect of their language. They were monolingual, they had not taken on any other languages, and so on. And it seemed like maybe their language was kind of a snapshot of human communication, spoken communication, at an earlier time in history, in its development. So that was sort of the idea, to go there and explore all of this. Also, the whole Noam Chomsky controversy about whether or not there's a universal grammar. These people seem to defy that rule. But I mean, for me, what was so amazing, just kind of on a journalistic level, was to go that deep into the Amazon. And I remember I was traveling with actually a young Chomsky and a guy named Tecumseh Fitch, who's a wonderful writer and scholar of language. He's written a beautiful book about the evolution of language. And I didn't even know Tecumseh was such a big deal at the time, although I should have. I think he was at like MIT at that point. He was from Harvard originally. But, it was interesting because we flew down to this city, Porto Velho. I'm going to forget what it was called. I think it was Porto Velho in sort of northern part of Brazil, which is where we met with this wonderful linguist, Dan Everett, missionary turned linguist. It's an amazing story. But anyway, we were then going to have to take a float plane deep into the jungle. This was incidentally not like when people do an environmentally minded tour of the Amazon with a large group of people and it's all very safe and figured. Like, we were flying in, and then the float plane was going to fly away and leave us for a week with no way to get out of there if anything went sideways, and things sometimes do with that tribe. But and I knew that it was a little dodgy when Tecumseh, who had been all over the world, he had studied a lot of animal vocal sounds, so he'd gone into jungles and so on. On the night before, he told me that he had written his will, before coming to Brazil. I was like, "What are you talking about?" He said, "Well, I mean, just in case we don't make it out." I said, "What?" He said, "Oh, well, no." He said, "John, we're doing something now very unusual and rare, and like most people don't ever do it." And I sort of put it together. I went, yeah, the whole sort of premise of this story is that this linguist had been a missionary with his wife, and their whole claim to fame was that they went where nobody else went and learned a language that nobody else could learn. And that really does mean we're going into really untrampled ground here. I also was a guy who had had a blood clot in his leg, a DVT, a couple of years before. I wasn't supposed to fly too much. I could be prone to getting another blood clot. Those can kill you if they become a pulmonary embolism. It was a 32 hours of flying to get to this place, because I had to fly to Sao Paulo and then various flights up to get to it. So in other words, I had put myself at strong risk for a new DVT, for a new blood clot, because my legs were crammed on these flights. Real risk for DVT doing that. And so then I realized, oh yeah, then I'm going to fly into the jungle and the float plane's going to fly away and just leave me there. I better not develop a deep vein thrombosis, because I'm going to be possibly dead meat. So these were all the fears that I had going in. And it's funny too, as a journalist, you meet a lot of people, and you always feel shyer than anybody suspects you're going to, as a person that, flies into situations that are unknown to them. But I felt a real kind of shyness about meeting, fellow human beings that were so different than me, that I was
Mm,
told were going to be so very, very different from me. And what was interesting was that they were and they weren't. That's what was so wonderful about it. In some respects, as Dan said at one point, they're still in the Stone Age. This is a laptop computer I'm testing them with. Yes, in some ways, I could not get through to them with simple communications like trying to explain why I was wearing bug spray. One of them had asked Dan, why did he spray that on him? And I said to Dan, oh, because I got Dan to translate. I said, Dan, can I let him know? Can I explain to him? He went, yeah, you can try. So I went bzzz, and I did this like weaving motion through the air with the sound of a bug, and I made it land on my arm. Then I slapped my arm. And he said, why did a plane land on his arm? Um, and then, or maybe I didn't slap it the first time. I just might have gone bzzz and landed. He went, why did a plane land on his arm? And then I showed that I slapped it. And he went, why did he hit himself? Does he not like himself? I mean, there was no,
yeah.
anyway, it was wacky and fascinating on that level. But then there was other things where we were watching, incredibly enough, we watched the Peter Jackson update of King Kong. And I apologize for the sirens. I can
Yeah.
pause if you want.
Could you stop them? Could you just yell out the window? Hey,
I wish
I'm
I could yell out the
podcasting
window.
here.
I live on a hospital route too, and sometimes we're lucky, but sometimes we're not. Yeah, no, Dan, because he's an amazing guy, showed them a DVD of because he had incidentally built this timbered house in the job. They lived on these incredibly, I don't want to use the word primitive because I think it's politically incorrect. Very simple platforms with no roofs and so on. They were really close to nature. But Dan had a snake-proof, bug-proof building that he built that had a generator so he could show DVDs, and he showed them Peter Jackson's King Kong. So here's a Stone Age tribe watching a movie, and they totally understood the movie. There was a part where Naomi Watts is looking at the big King Kong, and one of them said he wants to marry her. In other words, because the ape or the giant gorilla or whatever he's supposed to be is looking at her obviously with desire and lust and love, and they totally read it in the face. Right. And then at certain points in the movie, I can't remember what it was, but they sort of looked at me like at funny parts and kind of smiled. They thought I was funny. They sort of picked up on this idea that I was amusing, and so they would kind of look to me when something funny happened. It was just, that was incredible. And then just on an intellectual level, everything I was learning about language and sounds that we make with our voices, and how these abstract thoughts in our heads are translated into air vibrations that we beam into each other's brains like telepathic beams, that we do this thing. I just had never really thought about how odd that was, but to hear Tecumseh and Dan, two very smart guys, but very down to earth guys, talking about this was just spectacular. It was like being in a college course or something in linguistics. It was just one of the greatest experiences. And then I got home, and had to write the thing, and then had that wonderful experience where you suddenly realize, yeah, I'm going to be dealing with these sort of complicated ideas about linguistics and Chomsky and this and that. But then the characters were just so huge. Dan was such a massive and fascinating guy. Been this religious convert as a kid and became this evangelist and married this fellow religious nut, we'll call him. And off they go to the jungle to, turn this tribe, to convert this tribe, teach them Christianity. And Dan himself got converted by them. He left religion because he saw the way they lived. There was something about the way they lived that he just loved. And I think is relevant to Sex at Dawn and so on, definitely.
I don't know if it was in your article or in Don't Sleep, There Are Snakes, Dan's memoir of his time there. But there's some exchanges between him and them when they're sort of getting to know each other. And I remember they're just so charming and interesting. I remember there's one where they say to him, so when he's been proselytizing, and they say to him, like, so Dan, did you know this guy Jesus? And he says, no, Jesus lived long ago. And they sort of consider that. And then they say, did your grandfather know Jesus? He says, no, this is long before my grandfather. And then they say, oh, okay, Dan, then we don't want to hear anything else about Jesus, right?
Yeah.
Like, just shut the fuck up about this fictional character. And so I think one of the things that was so fascinating to me about your account and Dan's account of them is, I mean, obviously the whole prehistoric life and the language thing is fascinating, but to me what's even more fascinating is the cognitive implications of some of these linguistic characteristics that you guys talk about, like the fact that, like, that they don't talk about, there are no kind of like reference words. So they don't say that that berry is red. They say that berry is the color of the setting sun. Or they don't say east, they say toward the river or away from the river. You know what I mean? So everything is,
Yeah.
I don't know if you've heard of a book called The Spell of the Sensuous. It's
No,
very
no.
interesting book. I forget the name of the author. He's based in Santa Fe, but um, his basic idea is that language, the origins of language, words were themselves like objectively present in the world, and what happened was that the reality of the objective world sort of got drained into language, so that now we use words without knowing what they mean and without really feeling their resonance for the things that they refer to. And we're more and more lost in this abstract world of ideas and symbols, and further away from what they, their reference. And I felt like the Pinaha somehow saw the danger of that and just avoided it. So if you didn't know, if it was outside of your personal experience, we don't give a shit about what you're talking about. Stop talking about it,
Yes. Yes. They things had to be totally concrete and observable, for them to feel that they existed, so that when they saw a flickering candle, they would say that the flame was going in and out of existence. That their terminology for existence, they applied it to a candle flickering, going in and out of darkness. And yes, so they had this sort of concrete, their use of language, approach to the world. No, it's interesting what you're saying about language sort of deadening as we use it. I mean, poetry, I think we write it and we read it in order to keep language alive, to startle ourselves still with a reference to a table, to try to see it in some way where it's fresh and new to us, or concepts like love or sex, beauty. And, I mean, I suppose, it's funny, I talked about how the notion of the Pitahan is some sort of snapshot of language as it was evolving. What they did, what they now know about all languages, well, they've known it for a long time, but it goes back to Sapir in the 1920s, but there is no such thing as a primitive language. There's no language that's less developed than any other. The language is unbelievably complicated. It's an incredibly complicated mental calculation, and it's an astonishingly complicated musculoskeletal maneuver to create and then to get it into someone's ears so that they can interpret it. It just, once you're doing that, you're a human being. And so you're doing what dogs and cats just can't do, although they can do an incredible amount of communication with their growls and whines and mews and so on. But the thing that we can do is we make a sound that represents something in the world. And it's simply, the smartest of animals can't do it. So we actually had a very smart parakeet, startlingly so. Rudy, he died last year. But Rudy was so smart that when we would forget to put seeds in Rudy's cage, and we were sitting in our living room and the cage is actually in the kitchen, Rudy would fly in and go and circle her and then fly back to her cage. She was like, "You idiots, feed me." So I thought, well, she's so smart and she spoke a lot of English. She could imitate us really well. So I thought, well, I'll just teach her the word seeds. There's no way that she can't. So every day when I would feed her, I would say seeds, and I would just pour, so that she would be able to say from her cage, seeds, if we forgot. Never happened. Never going to happen, as I read up on animals, and the smartest of animals. There is a woman that trains parrots that claims that her parrots do this. I don't know. I'd have to see real strong evidence. A lot of people doubt it, because she would have like the one parrot that does. But this idea of representing things in the world with a sound that you make is remarkable, and to your point about the Pitahan, that sort of language had this presence to them. And even so if you've got a boat and you can make a sound for boat, the redness of the boat is like a concept that's kind of detached from the boat in a weird way. We've recursively put them together. We've put one idea inside another in a way that Dan, the whole sort of point of Dan's linguistic study of the Pitahan and what he said defied Chomskyan linguistics was that they lacked this sort of one universal, which was recursion in sentences, recursion of ideas. That's one idea fitting inside another, like a Chinese or what are the Russian doll box or whatever the hell those things are. It's actually a recursive thing to say the red boat on the shore, because you are actually putting the idea of redness inside a sentence and putting it inside the boat somehow. So Dan had this way of parsing the way they spoke to make me and actual linguistic scholars understand that the Pitahan were doing something subtle that kind of removed those two things, separated them from each other in an interesting way. Yeah, it was, and I must say, it was very hard for me to understand these concepts, but I struggled through. I think it was fascinating stuff.
It occurs to me that virtually every religious and spiritual tradition is oriented toward the same thing, which is be here now, right? It's stop all the monkey talk in your head, be in the moment, experience the present moment, whether it's through your breathing or your lotus position or, whatever it is you're doing to pull attention to the here and the now. And reading about these people, it seems like their entire language and culture is about preserving that thing that the rest of us have lost, that
yes,
being in the present. So that's why they don't want to know. They don't want to hear some abstraction that you heard from someone and someone heard from someone else. They want to know you experienced this, then I'm interested. You didn't, then stop it.
Yes.
And I remember one, and again, I pardon me, I don't remember if it was in your article or in the book. It's all sort of blended together in my head, but some psychologists come in and they want to do tests, cognitive tests with the people. And maybe it was even guys in the group with you, they had laptops and they're like, okay, let's see, we'll give you, a piece of candy if you can figure this out faster than the other guy, and they would do these kind of games. And Dan said, like, this isn't going to work. Like they're not going to do this because the whole idea of someone winning and other people losing is offensive to them. It's like, well,
yes.
Steven Pinker says that, and Richard Dawkins say that kind of competitiveness and me first attitude is universal to human nature. It's kind of like the linguistic thing with Noam Chomsky. And their existence disproves so many of these assumptions about the universality of certain human traits.
It certainly seemed to, no question about it. I mean, one of the funny things, I'm just remembering now as we flew in, because Dan had made these claims and they seemed so unusual. I thought like he said that, for instance, they didn't have art. And I thought, wow, a people that doesn't make any representational stuff. And he had said to me, boy, when I first was told by this missionary that I was going into the jungle to live with this tribe, I thought, oh, it's going to be amazing. I'm going to see all these necklaces and all that beaded stuff and face paints and so on. He said, and I come, and they got nothing. They got like a couple of like stones sitting on their platform with like a little bit of leafage over top so they don't get rained on too heavily, and like no adornments, nothing, and no art, no representation. And I thought, come on, that can't be right. Well, sure enough, they did live in that totally stripped down way. But what worried me, because as a journalist, you always go in and you're thinking, what's going to happen when I see the thing that completely disproves what this guy's saying? And I realize he's a charlatan and I still have to write the story and I still have to hang with him for a week. So we land in this little float plane on a stretch of river that was barely wider than the wingspan. Like we come down over the canopy. I'm thinking, where are we landing? And we've been flying over thick, dense broccoli for an hour. and we sort of weasel and we worm in, and then there's a little glint of river, and then we land in this thing, and the Pitahan, which were up on the hillside waiting for us, they'd heard the plane coming. Within minutes of my hitting ground and helping get our supplies up to the house, a little boy runs out of the jungle holding a beautifully carved balsa wood, looks like balsa wood, float plane. It's the plane we've landed, and he's made it, and it's got a propeller. And I look at it and I go, that's art. Oh God, what am I going to say to Dan? Like, this is embarrassing. I go, Dan, and Dan barely looks up. Dan's like struggling with some horrible, complicated generator thing. And he goes, that'll be lying in the weeds in 2 minutes. His point being, yeah, they make that because they're in the now. They're excited, and they're skilled, and they're smart, and they're artistic. So they've seen the plane, or maybe he was anticipating the plane. No, it would have been seeing the plane. It wouldn't be, they don't anticipate. So he would have seen the plane, been excited, made the plane. And I thought, there's no way it's going to be in the weeds. And that's a beautiful plane. That kid's going to want to play with that tomorrow. Right. It was in the weeds within like 10 minutes. Just this broken piece. I took a photograph of it. I was like, I can't believe it. Like, and Dan, you couldn't catch Dan out. Like, Dan had lived with these people for 30 years. He knew what he was talking about. And that, incidentally, is one of the beautiful moments of journalism, like where you just go, oh yeah, this guy's got it. And it was beautiful how it fit his theory. It also, it was just sort of wonderful on so many levels, because I didn't have to think of this tribe of people as being uninterested in representing their world. They weren't stupid. They weren't uncultured. It didn't fit their sort of worldview to keep these things as memorials and to have them around. The next time a plane came, they could get excited again. Yeah. But be here now, to your point.
Right. So there's art, but it's art like sand painting is art, right? The whole point of it is it's here, it's beautiful, and the next minute we're on to something else.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. You said when we first started talking, you said, I expected them to be totally alien, and they were, and they weren't. So where did what kind of things happened that made you feel like, oh, we're the same, even though our worlds are totally different?
Definitely the looks that I was getting during the movie, like with the funny parts where they were sort of looking to me to see if I was getting the joke and enjoying the joke. That was crazy. Yeah. Well, I mean, to be honest with you, the unexpected thing about these people was that they're women were extremely attractive. And cross-culturally, let's put it that way, because I just said something very, very New York centric or something. They were very attractive to me. They were very attractive to Dan. He had not been expecting that. They were sort of like cute and sexy. And they were, they were not unaware of it, the girls, but they were very careful, because one of the things that would happen was, and Dan had told me this, if you look with anything that looks like undue interest or intent at their women, the men might kill you. I thought, well, that would be bad. So talk about a prohibition on being overtly male gazy. But I guess I guess when I say something was bridging the gulf just around the whole male-female thing. I would say that the children, that was amazing. These little boys, maybe they were 10, 11, playing in the river, jumping off this tree and like talking to me or trying to communicate with me, communicating their joy and their fun. And then they got me to go in the water. They wanted me to go. So they could definitely communicate. And it was, that was just, I don't know. It was amazing. They could have been my son.
Were they fascinated by you at all? Or were they just used to these people coming in from the sky and who couldn't talk,
Well, I think they were not fascinated. It's interesting. They were told the first thing they asked was, what's his name in Crooked Head? Because that's what they called the English language, was Crooked Head, because any language that isn't their language is crooked. It's full of lies. It's full of distortions. It's full of inaccuracies. It's inferior, which was fun too, because so many linguists or missionaries came into their world over the last century, they were going to be looking at this primitive language that was somehow not as good as English or whatever language, Portuguese and so on. And that's exactly what the Pitahan thought of foreign languages to them.
Yeah.
But they asked what my name was in Crooked Head. Dan told them, and they tried to say it, and they sort of tossed it around. A few of them said it, and then they rejected it. And then they gave me the name of a tribe member who lived downriver. I never saw him, but they thought I looked like him a little bit. So they just gave me a name. They didn't, I guess on that level, they didn't really care who I was, except only in as much as I looked like a Pitahan. Right. That was okay. Yeah. That's the way I interpreted that. I don't know if they were, particularly interested, because the only question they asked was, what's his name in Crooked Head? And then they renamed me.
You ever read a book called Nisa? You ever heard of that book? Nisa,
no.
Nisa. It's a fascinating book. It's written by Marjorie Shostak, who was doing a PhD at Harvard in anthropology, probably in 66, 67, something like that. And for her doctoral research, she wanted to live with the Kung San, the exclamation point.
Yes.
In the Botswana. And so she learned the language. I guess at Harvard, there was someone who could teach her the language. And then she went. And her idea was to write about, this is like the first wave of women getting into anthropology and archaeology. And, it had been so male dominated up until then. And so she wanted to write about women's experience in this hunter-gatherer culture. And so she went there speaking the language fairly well, and she tried to interview women, and the women were just like, who the fuck are you asking me about my sex life and, childbirth, and like, get the hell out of here, forget it. So she was getting nowhere. And then finally she met a woman named Nisa who understood, who got it. It's like, okay, you're coming from this other world. You want to understand how we live and how we think because we're different from you and so on. And she was like, okay, I'm down. And so the dissertation and later the book became about this one woman rather than a sort of survey of lots of different women. And it's such a beautiful book. Because
I've written it down.
It's organized in life stages. So it's childhood, adolescence, marriage, childbirth, death of parents, and I'm always reminded of it when, someone says something like you were saying, where it's like, okay, they're very different, but they're the same because, obviously it's extremely different, but these passages of life, they're the same. Falling in love, falling out of love, the disappointment of a relationship that ends or changes, and the pain of betrayal, and the death of a child, or the death of a parent. Like, these things are universal.
Yeah.
And in so many ways, those are sort of the primary elements of human life. The rest of it is like, okay, it's important, but it's almost like that's the sauce and these are the meat and potatoes in the stew.
Well, a couple of I don't know if I'm cutting you off. Let me know. But just a couple of things, that you said there sparked a memory for me, which I had actually not thought about since doing the story. When you mentioned that author kind of wanted to live with the tribe. The weird thing was that I got back from that week in the jungle, and I realized I have to go back. It was like an addiction. It was like I'd become a heroin addict. I came back, and I said to my wife, our son was 6 years old at the time, and I was on fire. I said, look, Dan raised his kids in the jungle. He was a missionary with his wife. They had their kids there, and the kids who I met, were now like American. They had been through American college system and so on, but they said it was the best thing that ever happened to them. Of course, their perspective was insane on life and the world. And I said, we've got to get Johnny into the jungle. I said, and we've got the perfect reason to do this. I said, I'm going to pitch a book. I'm going to do a book about this. And we're going in. I got to get back in. And to my amazement, my wife, who won't even camp, I'm not kidding. Like, she won't go on a camping trip. She was like, yeah, it sounds like we got to do this. Like she was totally game. Like, I don't know what I was giving off. Yeah, I've never explored this before. Like, so yeah, I get back and she's like totally down. And we go through this period of like weeks, maybe a couple of months where we're like, yeah, how would we do this? We can do this. We'll get them out of the school. And this is a couple of Upper East Side New Yorkers. I mean, and I guess I wanted out of this elegant 2-bedroom apartment on the Upper East Side, which I love, but I wanted out, man. I wanted back into that jungle. I wanted whatever I had tasted. So it's funny you say, what was the same, what was different. There was enough the same that I felt like I could live with them and wanted to learn from them. And there was obviously so much different that I thought, and different in good ways, that I thought I've got to get back there to have more of whatever that is. So yeah, I had totally forgotten that. And then, it's funny, Dan wanted to write his own book, which was totally made sense. And he said, John, would you be okay to step off and like not expand? And I said, of course not, dude, it's your story. And to his great credit, he ended up doing what most people wouldn't do. He ended up writing a really good book, which I didn't, feel bad that he had gone ahead and done, because I would have written a very different thing from a different sort of, the camera would have been pulled further back on his life and his wife and so on. But no, I wanted to go back. I had not thought about that. I wanted to go back so badly that years later, when the New Yorker suggested a story about that acai berry from the Brazilian jungle, I agreed to do that story just to get back into the Amazon. And it was pretty great, but it was not the same thing. Right. It was not the same. I mean, I had a couple of days where I was on a little tributary in a canoe, and with a guy from Whole Foods. To their great credit, Whole Foods was thinking of taking on the acai product, and he wanted this cool old hippie. He was like one of the old hippies that still worked there. He was just awesome. We were just, we were in the same state. And Tecumseh was like this. What we did, basically what it is you get soft-handed guys like us into the Brazilian jungle, and it's just, in a weird way, it is kind of life-changing. What a cliche, but it is. It's just astounding. It's so good.
I often think that one of the few ways you can tell what is naturally human versus cultural indoctrination is how quickly you become used to it. Yeah, it's certain kinds of freedom, you're there for a day or two, and then you come back to normal life, and it's like, what the fuck is going on? I mean, there was a time in my life when I spent some time in sex clubs in Spain, which are just bars, but there's a room in the back where people are having sex.
Yeah.
I hang out in those in a club like that for a while, and then you go to a normal bar, and it's like, this is ridiculous. This is just like a festival of denial and delusion in this place, right? Everybody's looking for someone to fuck, but they're all pretending they're not. The music's so loud, nobody can talk. Whereas in the club, the music was quiet because people were talking. It's like, this is a fake version of something that it's so easy. And it's like, I would have thought that like being in a club where, a couple is fucking over on the sofa would be really weird. It's not weird at all. It's just like, oh yeah, well, they're into each other. So, who cares?
Wow. Yeah. Yeah.
Anyway, I'm talking too much about my sex life in this. I don't know what it is about you, John.
Well, you just remember that prank that I pulled, and you think that I can actually do that. You're like, yes, I'm talking to a sexual master.
I'm really interested, obviously I'm interested in sexuality. It's a lifelong fascination for me, but I'm also interested, obviously, in this sort of transcultural question. And so, for example, I tried to get information from anthropologists about situations in which anthropologists had sex with the people they were studying. Of course it happens, right?
Yeah,
but nobody wants to talk about it. the most I could get out of anyone was someone said, well, in the sort of world of anthropology, it's well known that a couple of women got pregnant and had babies with the people that they were studying, but I'm not even going to tell you their names because we just don't talk about it, which, I understood. But there's a guy named Kenneth Good, who was a doctoral student of Napoleon Chagnon, famous for his studies of the Yanomami people.
Oh yeah.
And Kenneth Good had it's a fascinating story because Napoleon Chagnon became famous by describing the Yanomami as extremely warlike, kind of the counterpoint to Daniel Everett and the Pinaha. He's describing the Yanomami as this incredibly brutal, warlike, horrible Hobbesian, tribe. And then it turns out that Chagnon was in fact triggering a lot of the violence that he reported by passing out machetes to one group and not the other group, and causing resentment and asking people to name their dead ancestors, knowing full well that was you never spoke the name of a dead person, that would impact their soul in all sorts of negative ways, their spirit. And so he couldn't get them to name their antecedents. So what he did was he went to each group and said, okay, well, name their antecedents, right? I'm not asking you to name yours, but, who was his father and who was her mother, thereby, creating resentment. And anyway, so Kenneth Good broke with him halfway through his doctoral thesis. But the reason I'm mentioning this is he fell in love with a Yanomami woman, and they ended up as a couple, and she came back to America with him and lived for a time in Philadelphia.
Wow. Crazy.
Thinking,
That's insane.
Like the wildest exchange student ever. Yes. And she ends up in Philadelphia. I mean, come on.
Wow. Nuts.
She didn't last long. I think a year or two, and she's like, fuck this, man. And she went back to Venezuela.
It's interesting. The Pitahan famously could not really be removed from their culture without, I don't think anyone ever tried, although one little girl, interestingly, I remember Dan telling me about a little girl that had to be taken out very young because she had a health crisis. So she had a little experience, like for, was it a couple of months? I don't know, in a hospital in the, in I don't know what Brazilian city, but it made her different in the tribe. And in fact, I think Dan was telling me that story because I think she was particularly good at helping him bridge the gap of the language, right, as he was trying to learn the language, because she had, just had enough distancing from it. But when I try to picture any of those Pitahan that I met trying to live in Philadelphia, it's just unimaginable. It just couldn't. I'm pretty sure it wouldn't work.
Yeah.
Well, it wouldn't, because they would not learn the language. That was one of the things. They were totally resistant to all other cultures. They just would not learn stuff that wasn't theirs. It was crooked head. Everything was crooked head that wasn't them. Amazing people. Yeah.
Yeah. There's a book called, sorry to keep mentioning books, but lots of this conversation resonates. There's a book called At Play in the Fields of the Lord by Peter Matheson.
I have heard of that book, of course, famous, but haven't read it.
He's a great writer. So many great books. The Snow Leopard won the National Book Award. He was one of the founders of the Paris Review, and turns out he was also a CIA informer in the 40s and 50s.
I did not know that.
Yeah, he was a very interesting. He was on the expedition where one of the Rockefellers was killed in Papua New Guinea, by a Stone Age tribe. Yeah. Anyway, this book is a novel, and the premise is fascinating. It's set in the Amazon jungle, and there are these two guys who are kind of roustabout Vietnam vets. They've got a small plane. They fly around and smuggle drugs or arms or booze or whatever, and just like make a living. And one of them's a Navajo, who was raised on the res, and the other's a New York Jew. played in the movie by Tom Waits. And
Oh, wow.
yeah,
Wow.
and the movie's fascinating cast. Daryl Hannah, Kathy Bates, John Lithgow, like
Oh, great.
crazy cast. Anyway, so they're flying over the jungle and they're running out of fuel, and they see a little landing strip and they land, and the local strongman says, okay, well, we'll fill your gas tank, but I want you to do a favor for me first. Like, okay, what's the favor? Well, there's an uncontacted tribe 20 miles up the river, and right now there are Christian missionaries on their way up there to try to make contact with them. And the thing is, if they make contact, then the government's going to set aside all this land as a reserve area, and logging and mining will be illegal. And I'm logging and mining the shit out of this place, and I'm making a lot of
Huh,
money. So I
huh.
want you to go and drop a bomb in the village, this Indian village, and kill these people and disperse them into the jungle so there won't be anyone for the missionaries to contact. That's
Whoa.
the favor you're going to do for me. Okay. So the
Yeah.
two guys fly out just to reconnoiter, and the village, there's a clearing. They find the clearing, and all the Indians hear the plane coming, and they all run into the jungle, and they sort of fly low over this clearing. And as they're flying, this one warrior runs out and fires an arrow at the airplane. And they're
Oh my.
laughing, like, yeah, right, you're going to shoot us down with an arrow, you idiot. And then they turn around and fly back to the village. And the next day they're supposed to go obliterate this tribe. That night they're getting drunk, and the Tom Waits character goes to bed. By the way, this is all in the first 20 or 30 pages of the book, so I'm not ruining. This is just setting up what happens, right?
Yes.
So yeah, Tom Waits goes to bed. The Navajo guy, played by an actor who I don't remember his name, but anyway, he's getting drunk, and then there's like no tequila left, and it's 2 a.m. and they're closing the bar and everybody's asleep or lying on the floor, and somebody says to him, well, if you really want to get drunk, drink some of this. And he puts this glass of brown liquid on the table, and he knocks it back, and it turns out it's ayahuasca.
Oh, yeah.
And so now he's tripping his face off, totally shit-faced, and he keeps seeing this vision of that Indian guy running into the field and firing an arrow at the airplane. And remember, this guy was raised on the reservation, a broken culture. He's seen the whole thing when the whites show up, and what happens. And he gets out, he goes out and he gets in the airplane, and he takes off and he flies toward the village, and he's a mile or two away from the village. He jumps out of the airplane with a parachute, ditches the plane, lands in the jungle, takes off all his clothes, buries them under a rock, and walks into the village naked.
Oh, wow. Great.
So he's essentially come from the future, right? So the
Yeah.
rest of the book is how he tries to help them deal with what he knows is coming, but they can't see it.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Oh, yeah. I got to read this
I
clearly.
mean, what a
Yeah.
setup,
Yeah.
what a
Yeah.
concept.
Fantastic.
I mean,
Yeah.
it's time travel, really. It's
Yeah.
just, it's incredible. Yeah.
Wow.
Anyway,
I like,
so
yeah. That's a
sorry
great
to,
plot idea. The idea of him also wanting to warn them of what's coming is kind of fantastic. Yeah.
yeah.
It does make me think a little bit of Dan, because Dan sort of did that with the Peter Han in a weird way. He, yeah, because he stopped the missionary stuff. Well, he did. His wife kept it up,
Yeah.
but he thought it was best to not bother them with that, and was. Yeah, I don't know. I guess he went back to the Stone Age in a weird way, in an
Well,
interesting way.
in his book, he talks about how he went there, intending to convince them, and in the end, they convinced him.
Yeah, they
And
converted him. It's
yeah,
awesome.
yeah, they converted him. Yeah, it's fascinating. I really, I mean, you are extraordinarily lucky to have had that experience. I mean,
I realized that it was great. It was one of the great reasons that I was happy to be working for the New Yorker. It was no, I don't know what other magazine would really send someone off on such a mission. I mean, especially since, the sort of crux of the issue was, is there a universal recursion in all language as Chomsky says there is? I mean, GQ might want an adventure story set there,
Yeah.
but they're not going to want the recursion story. So,
Yeah.
that's really what was so great about working for the New Yorker, because you would go in there for that weird nugget, but they also, of course, wanted all of the surrounding adventure, human interest. And I mean, the best compliment I got on that story was really when Dorothy Wickenden, one of the senior editors there, said, the way you ended up making that a whole story about marriage, because it really was kind of about this missionary couple that splits up because of a difference in how they view the tribe and religion and so on. I mean, she just loved that. That was kind of a layer of the story as well. The most exciting stories you write are about more than one thing, obviously. And that was a great one. That was a really fun one.
And they give you the space to really, to do that. It's not a photo essay. There's one photo at the beginning, great photo. I don't know if you took it or someone else took it.
No, they sent a great photographer in whose name is escaping me. But he took such an amazing picture of Dan in the river, just his head above water and the guy in the canoe.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know that the New Yorker publishes stories that long on a regular basis anymore.
What was that? Because like 5,000 words or something?
Oh, it was at least 8,000. It was really long.
Right.
It might even have been one of the ones that went to 10,000.
Yeah.
And back in those days, I can talk like now but it was sort of pre-digital a little bit. Digital was happening, but it had not yet eroded publishing to the same degree. So there was still advertising pages and dollars being pumped in. I was lucky enough to do a couple of stories. I did a story on medicinal leeches. It was the first story I ever did for them. The return of, this medieval idea to high-tech operating rooms, because they were used in microsurgeries, reattaching digits and so on, where you would want to drain the wounded area of certain toxins and poisons and so on that would build up. And the best way to do it, they discovered, was to attach leeches. But they were also discovering that leeches were good for certain arthritic pains and so on. So the New Yorker sends me to do this story. And that was probably 2005 when the magazine was like still super healthy, not yet at all sort of eaten into. And it would have been like writing for the New Yorker in the 1960s during its fattest years in a funny way. I mean, I think I went to 10,000 words on the leeches story. It was assigned at 6. I kept finding out interesting stuff. We were in fact checking practically, maybe not quite fact checking, editing anyway, where I happened to mention to my editor, oh God, there's this clinic in Dusseldorf that's doing really interesting stuff with arthritis. She went, just grab a plane, just, head out there. I mean, now at magazines, you have to beg to fly to Los Angeles instead of doing it as a phoner. Could you maybe do it on the phone? This was like, oh, hop the plane and go to Dusseldorf. And it was way better to see stuff in person. Sure. So it was a really fat and wonderful time in publishing. Are
you still working for them, or is that finished?
I'm not. I mean, mostly because I'm doing another book right now. So I'm in effect trying not to return to magazines. And partly, that magazine and no magazine is quite what it was. It reads beautifully. It looks fantastic, but the culture is different now. I mean, there is a little more concern around word lengths and expenses, and the vibe is just correctness.
I mean, I'm not speaking for you.
That's super interesting.
All me. But hey. I have been I had the New Yorker delivered in Barcelona. I paid, extra for that every week. I'd pile them up. I would never throw one away that I hadn't read, even if it was from a year earlier. Anya will tell you, I'll have a stack of 50 New Yorkers in the van when we go camping. But I've just gotten so annoyed with it. The cartoons are just dumb. It's just like, what are you doing? Who are you trying to impress with this? Like, well, it's just all this, Latinx. Fuck you, Latinx. I've been to Mexico. Nobody says Latinx in Mexico. This is all just insular, Harvard, Princeton grads trying to impress each other. I feel the same about NPR. It's like I used to love NPR, and now I listen to it, and it's like, who are you talking to? I don't get it.
What freaks. I know, but this is what I know, just having worked in magazines for so long, and so many different magazines, that they have to, in a way, respond to the zeitgeist and the changes in the culture. I think at least here I am saying they have to. I really am a magazine guy, aren't I? Because why do they have to? But they feel they do, and yeah, I don't know. I guess I mean, this is part of why I'm very happy to not be in magazines right now, because I couldn't conform to what I suspect I would have to conform to.
Yeah.
Or at least I don't want to be looking over my own shoulder too much. Now, having said that, when I was finishing my book about The Voice, I was very sort of happy. It was during the Trump years. Everyone was enraged at everybody else and political correctness and all the rest of it. And I remember saying to my wife, gee, I'm kind of glad I'm writing this kind of science-y book about the voice. And then, of course, I realized I was going to have to write about the Black voice, the gay voice, men's and women's voices. I was wandering into every imaginable minefield. I really want accents. It was, Black English, it was all there. The voice of leadership, Obama versus Trump, and so on. What I did discover was the reflexive tip of my fingers instinct to just write the way I used to write if I was writing about Black voice, let's say. And when I say the way I used to write kind of unconsciously as like a white guy that knew he ruled. I knew that whatever I said was right.
Right.
I didn't have to think about it. Whose sensitivities do I have to be worried about? I mean, I'm a pretty liberal guy. I'm just going to reflexively, instinctually do the right thing because I've been inculcated with all the right stuff.
Right.
I found as I got granular that there was like 1,000,001 ways in which I could just stop and say, take a deep breath and figure out whether or not you're actually saying something that's going to sound really fucking stupid or racist, even though you're not intending to be whoever intends to be. I guess what I'm saying is, and when I tiptoed through the male and female voice stuff, places where I kind of tried to observe the niceties were actually mind expanding for me and very good for me. I just got to say that. I mean, and this is not a great anecdote because I'm not coming up with good examples, but there were examples where I was like, yeah, okay, my kind of off the cuff, I know everything, and I'm just a good guy, and people will know it. That wasn't going to really cut it. Now, at the New Yorker and NPR and other magazines, they may be bending over too far backwards, and maybe that's also because of hiring. You're going to hire more women of color, more trans people, and they're in the room. They're part of the conversation. So I was lucky enough, quote unquote, to be in a room by myself, wrestling with the manuscript alone. That would have to meet an editor's specifications, but there wasn't someone whose sensitivities I could injure that was sitting right beside me as we kicked around the ideas verbally in a bull session in an editing situation. Right. So I guess this is my way of kind of apologizing for the New Yorker and stating what I think is, my how I pity them. I mean, how painful it's got to be on an hour to hour, minute to minute basis there. I can't even imagine, because they're wrestling with a huge sea change.
Right. And I mean, the New Yorker is a particularly potent example of this because of their history of having given voice or given a platform to so many prominent writers, many of whom now would be deplatformed. I mean, I don't know, did Norman Mailer publish stories? I mean, certainly John Updike did.
I was going to say Updike did. I think Norman was deliberately kept out of the gates. He was not invited in.
Pugilistic. Yes. But yeah, I mean,
but
Hemingway,
great example.
I mean, I guess the question is, I understand the pressures on the publishing world, but I also feel like, isn't there value in, I mean, so when a young Black trans person is writing an article from their perspective, they don't need to worry about our perspective. They just write from their perspective. And that's valuable. And that's why they're hired, right?
Yep.
But because white men are seen as dominant in some sense, white men are expected to apologize for their perspective and be self-editing and self-correcting and self-censoring and trying to incorporate all these other perspectives into their perspective, which is kind of an artificial endeavor. You know, it's like, why not just write from your perspective and acknowledge that it's a partial vision of reality, as opposed to apologizing for it?
Well, I guess I would say that you are inevitably, no matter how you strain to not do, you're going to be writing from your own perspective. As E.B. White said in the Elements of Style, you know, writing is self-revelation, whether you want it to be or not. So that, yeah, I guess, you know, instead of, you use the terms like self-editing or whatever, self-censoring, I would say, what about adjusting? You know, you literally, as the sort of white cis guy that's always been the voice, you know, what if you just become aware of adjusting certain easy phrases that leap to the end of your pen so readily, but with a little bit of sensitivity to the fact that, wait, we've kind of widened the tent. There's more people inside here now, maybe, or we're trying to get other readers too. The thing that, you know, Martin Amis said something interesting about writing for magazines. He said in the introduction to the Moronic Inferno, where he was saying these essays were written for a number of different publications, each of which has sort of a different in-house style and even mood and take. He said, you know, you don't as a writer have to consciously change yourself. You just kind of change according to what magazine you're writing for. In other words, writers are always doing this. They've always known how to do it. Everybody does it. And, you know, so what Martin's saying is, if you're writing for the Rolling Stone, you kind of know there's a looseness in the language. If it's for the New Yorker, there might be kind of a wry, distanced, ironical take that's a little different than it would be for GQ and so on.
Right.
So what am I saying? Writers are doing it all the time anyway. So now, and it's not self-editing, let's say. Maybe it's not self-censoring. It's just reading the room. So maybe what we need to do, all of us, is read the room. I mean, back in the day, you know, like when a writer would write for the New Yorker, who, I mean, well, it's probably true to this day. I should ask an African-American writer of my acquaintance if he feels like he's doing something to his language, meeting a certain New Yorker take.
Whiten it up a little.
Yeah. You know, is that whitening up? Does that feel that way? I don't know how. I should ask that sometime. But yeah, I mean, these are all deep and difficult waters. You're certainly, you're not wrong to be suggesting that everybody's too hat up. And that it's creating a product that maybe kind of feels like it's grinding against its own gears in certain ways.
And trying to please everyone. And I feel like one of the beauties of writing is writing to not please everyone or anyone.
Yes.
Right.
No.
Christopher Hitchens.
Yes.
All right. Christopher Hitchens and Norman Mailer. Those two would get along beautifully, I think.
You know, for years, I didn't read Norman for years because I was such a New Yorker-y writer that I sort of knew Norman was viewed with some suspicion, although I think David Remnick's a fan. But so I sort of didn't read Norman. I was always reading New Yorker-y writers. I read Armies of the Night. Is that the name of it? The one?
Yeah.
I was just in a fever. It was like last year. I was like, oh my God, this is spectacular. It's so funny. It's so fabulous. It's so great. It's so not New Yorker-y.
Right.
Because he's so self-referential.
He just doesn't give a shit.
Criticizing himself, just belittling himself and then aggrandizing himself. It's just all over the map in this fucking fabulous way.
It's vital.
God, how was I? Oh. Yeah.
Well,
why was I not reading them? Yeah.
That's the thing that gets lost in all this, you know, sort of tiptoeing around is vitality, right?
Great word.
So Christopher Hitchens, what I was going to say earlier, there's some essay he wrote, or I don't know if it was an interview or whatever, but he said one should always write posthumously. Write as if you're already dead. So
Yeah,
who
that's
gives
great.
a fuck, right?
Yes, that's
You're dead,
hilarious.
you're gone. This book is going to outlive you, and so it's going to be in someone's hands. So write for them, and not with your own personal concerns. And I feel like that's something that's been lost in the last 15 or 20 years in American culture, that was one of the best things about American literary culture, that
Oh,
these,
100%.
and British as well, I guess, but just this like, I don't give a shit, I'm Charles Bukowski, I like to fuck and I get drunk and I vomit and I write poetry, and that's the way it is.
Yep. Yep.
I mean,
Freewheelingness, a certain
Henry Miller,
freewheelingness.
yeah,
Yes, Henry Miller.
shamelessness.
Absolutely. Walt
um
Whitman. Walt
yeah,
Whitman,
oh
for heaven's
fuck
sake,
yeah, yeah, he was a giant of shamelessness.
Yeah, I mean, it's the American swag, man.
Yeah.
And I mean, but so much of that American swag, I think everybody we named were white guys, that were,
Well, okay, but
you know,
we could name lots of black guys. I was just I mean, Malcolm X, I guess, isn't a literary figure, but James Baldwin, I
I was going
mean,
to say James Baldwin, sure.
yeah.
Yeah.
And then it goes into music as well, and maybe it's even more identifiable in music, with James Brown, or Bird, and just like this kind of like freedom of concern for established norms, which is the essence of jazz, which is mainly black art, if you can even call it an art black. But yeah, I feel it makes me sad to see those voices getting lost. And it's not just magazines, publishing as well. It's like, oh, you got to fucking go through the sensitivity training, and it's got to be read by people of every gender and color, and it's like, come on.
Well, I must have blathered the last time about how I couldn't get my second novel published. It was just before the Me Too movement. And I was sensing in the air Puritanism that really came out of David Foster Wallace's essay, I Will Always Insist About Updike, where he called them, this priapic, satyr, and this buffoon of self-referential masturbatory sexuality and so on.
Yeah, but one
And
guy lived into his 80s and one guy killed himself in his 30s.
ain't it interesting? I know, interesting,
yeah.
right?
Vitality, I'm telling you.
Well, so I sort of had this realization, my God, like much as I enjoy reading Friends and so on, like these guys were being very careful about sex. There was no question about it. And it was not freewheeling. And I thought, okay, well, like what if someone wrote a sexy book? So I did, and I could not get it published. I mean, I asked for it. I did the most deliberately taboo thing I could. But then I softened it. I was doing a father-daughter incest thing, kind of playing on what is incredibly popular on pornographic websites, so I hear. But he, my agent wisely, and I didn't need her to say this, but I realized that I didn't want to make a real biological father sleep with his daughter and then have him be a sympathetic character the way Nabokov so brilliantly does with Humbert in Lolita. I liked that as an exercise. That fascinated me as a first person narrative. How do you do what he did there, which was a really sneaky maneuver? But that had always fascinated me. Yeah. But I didn't want to do that. I didn't want to write a real father. So I make a very sympathetic man that's actually being tricked into thinking that he had a biological daughter that he had not known about. So she comes into his life as someone that he thinks he's adopting as a biological daughter, but she's actually on a mission to seduce him. He has a nemesis that controls her, this particular very bad boyfriend. And she's sort of on a mission, and she has her reasons for doing it that are emotional and so on, because the man in question had actually been with her mother, and she's been convinced that he treated her badly. He didn't, but she's been manipulated. Long story short, it sets up a situation in which a father is trying as hard as he can not to lust for his unbelievably attractive daughter that's being very seductive in very subtle ways. And I thought it would be a really fun exercise. Publishers I spoke to it about it before I had finished writing it were initially interested, saying, oh, that's so interesting. You're going to let us look at this taboo subject sort of through our fingers. We can look, but because we know it's not real. But by the time the book was actually written and ready to be circulated, we were just, it's funny, it was just before Trump and everything blew up. But it was already in the air, and it was already like, I might have told your audience this before, but we did have editors saying, I couldn't put it down over the weekend. On Monday, Lisa, and that's my agent, I'll get back to you with a figure. And then Monday would come, and we had a couple of editors like say, I'm so sorry I took it to the higher ups. And it's like, we just can't do this now. And to me, I will forever bitch about this, that it was so unsophisticated of them, because the book, it's not a real incest situation. It's all told, you'll be surprised to learn, at a higher level of irony and, I hope, wit and humor. And they were just, and sophistication of narrative point of view. And they just weren't, they were either pretending not to get it or not wanting to even get it. Yeah. So the book was just, we barely got it published from a tiny publisher on the West Coast, although a good one, Counterpoint, and their a division of theirs, which his name is going to escape me, even smaller, but no one would even review it. That was the amazing thing. And I managed to hoodwink the New York Times into doing a half-page story about me. I knew a writer that I had met. He had been covering something else, and I sort of talked up my novel, and he was like, "Oh, I'll do this as like Colapinto's complaint." I think that's what they called it. My agent was over the moon. She was like, "John, the New York Times has done a half page. They have to review it." They never reviewed it. And nobody reviewed it. So they hushed it up. Yeah. So does that make me mad? Does that turn me into a Trumper? No.
What's it called?
No. It's called Undone. It used to be called An Upright Man, which is a much better title. It's from the book of Job, An Upright Man, because my hero is tested like Job. Right. The devil tests him. And An Upright Man also has a little pun in the title. Some people may pick up.
Little one.
And I'd loved that title, but for some reason, the Canadian publisher that first agreed to publish it said, Undone will be more snappy and more commercial. I believed them, and it was a mistake. But, it's funny. My poor wife and son had to hear me, even before Trump was elected, I was being Trump in this apartment. I was like, I don't know what I was just railing about political correctness and stuff. But, I calmed down after a while. It was like, some books have their moment, and it didn't have its moment. It met a moment of, yes, censoriousness, virtue signaling, fake feminism. When the book came out, I was part of a Twitter storm of it was hilarious, actually, when the article came out in the Times. So the book was coming out in a couple of days, so no one could have read it. I had young women, young fake feminists, or let's say performative Twitter feminists, saying, "What an asshole this guy is! What a creepy book." They hadn't read it.
Of course, yeah.
And that, it was just an exercise in Twitter. I was new to Twitter. Someone said, "You can promote the book on Twitter," and I just saw like, this is insane. I really had a glimpse of the madness very early. Yeah. I spent a whole night awake watching the Twitter things roll out. And at one point, I just flashed back at a young woman. I didn't really know much about her. I wasn't even sure who it was, because my eyes are no good, and it was small, her avatar. But I said, it might be a good idea to read the book first. And maybe I've told this before, but people piled in saying, "Hey, that's the equivalent of a literary dick pic. This older white male writer telling this young, I think she was a woman of color, to read his dirty book. It's the equivalent of a literary dick pic," which incidentally is a great fucking line, which was made it all the scarier. And then people piled in. So the guy that said that had like 3 billion followers or something. So all of a sudden, and I saw it start to gather steam. And I thought, I was still at the New Yorker at the time, and it was like 3 o'clock in the morning. I thought, by dawn, I won't have a job. I'm done. Like I'm going to be one of those stories.
Yeah.
What did I do? Courageously, I began to apologize on Twitter. It was my greatest act of courage in standing up to the forces of political correctness. I apologized my ass off, and I just quieted the storm. And by the morning, it had not taken fire more than that. And I did not get fired from my magazine, but I might have been if it had gone much further. So yeah, I've been in the storm.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think I have given a fair bit of thought to writing an erotic novel set in prehistory.
Oh,
Um,
prehistory. What a great
yeah,
idea.
yeah, sort of Clan of the Cave Bear meets 50 Shades of Grey.
Yes.
Because as I'm sure you do as well, you want to repurpose your knowledge, right? So
Yes.
even when I was writing Sex at Dawn, I was thinking this would be so much fun to write as a novel with characters doing these things.
Yes.
Um,
Yes.
but one of the things I thought early on is that if I do this, I want to do it with Anya, my partner, who's also a writer, and have her be the face of the book.
Oh,
The book's
neat.
written by a young woman, not a 65-year-old white guy.
Yeah.
And we would collaborate on it, but you do the interviews. I'm the prehistory consultant, right?
Nice. Yes.
And
Yes.
also have the main character in the book be a woman. So I think, having the male presence is asking for trouble. And of course, there will be men in the book, but it's a book about a woman's experience, a woman's perspective, written primarily by a woman. I think that diffuses a lot of that animosity.
Yes. That's brilliant. But you're making me realize now that when I wrote this book, I wanted to be freewheeling like Norman and Henry Miller and Updike. But I read The Room. I couldn't help but do so. So I wanted to write a book about this very terrible thing called the male gaze, which just happens to be the thing that keeps our species propagating itself. So it can't be that bad. Erotic response from the male to the visual sight of a female, and vice versa. It's all good stuff. So I
Yeah.
wanted to write about that and destigmatize it. Um, and but I thought I was going to write this deliberately provocative thing. But what I found as I was writing it was that the David Foster Wallace had taken up room in my head, had taken up. And when I was raised, what I saw of the sexual revolution and how destructive it nearly was to my parents. My dad at 42 had an affair with a 19-year-old, but he didn't break up my parents' marriage. They split up and then they got back together. But I saw the ruination and lived it and the pain of it as a teenager. So there was a part of me that wasn't Updikean, that couldn't look at the guy that's the suburban husband that fucks all the women, the wives, because when they're off at work, because he's a writer at home and he can do that. There was a part of me that was like, well, on David Foster Wallace's side. And I discovered as I tried to write this thing that I was always adjusting, to come back to that word that I said. And I was suddenly realizing, okay, I've got a female in here that's going to be seducing this guy. So she's being manipulated by her bad boyfriend. Well, who is she? Like, why am I making her just this puppet? Like, she can't just be an empty puppet. So I found myself filling her in and having so much fun giving her motivations and then her ambivalences. And I began to realize the book's about the girl. So did anybody say that in the few reviews I ever did get online and so on? The book was about the woman. So my Anya was awakened in my head as my co-author. I had to bring it to life. And frankly, it's a fabulous exercise. Yeah. So I can't lament that men don't get to just freewheeling to go out there and talk about their hard-ons anymore. We have to bring in...
you got to be a rapper to do that.
Yeah, exactly. We got to bring in the female perspective yourself. And my God, your book gets all the better for it.
Yeah.
And maybe
you do, right? And
exactly. Maybe you do.
I mean, I also, another book I think about writing is sort of an erotic memoir, right? Like, Dylan's Tangled Up in Blue, but in book form, like
yes.
There's this woman, there was that woman, there's this situation, there's that situation. And not in a like, look at me, look at, how many women I've been with, aren't I cool kind of way, but more of a like, I see that as a deeply vulnerable book that would be like, this is my path, this is the path that I've taken in my erotic life, and it's been very gratifying and surprising, but it's happened because there's so many lovely women in the world. There are women who saw, like Nina Hartley's, who saw a suffering 15-year-old boy and was like, hey kid, come here, let me help you with that, right? Let me show you some things that are going to help you in life. And so the book is, every chapter of it is like, and then another lovely, generous, kind, wise, fucking sexy woman took pity on me. You know what I mean?
Well, yeah, but you're describing someone who doesn't hate women.
No, that's it.
And I
It's a
used,
love letter to women.
and now I'm going to boast about something. Courtney Love started following me on Twitter about 2 weeks ago. And she tweeted at me that I was, because we had met in Paris when I was doing this story some years ago.
Oh, I think I
Boy,
saw
like,
you were in the back of a taxi cab or something.
yes, I took photograph. We ended up sitting in her limo and talking for hours outside my hotel, where my wife and son were in that hotel. So nothing bad was going to. Well, I suppose something bad could have happened. And looking at those photos now, I think maybe something bad was supposed to happen, but I'm a very good boy. And so Courtney and I kept thinking, my God, Kurt Cobain was here. Let me at least make out with her. As far as I remember, I didn't. No, Donna, I'm kidding. Oh, I'd had a few drinks. I don't know. No, I didn't. No. This is the point of the story, is that Courtney, like 4 days ago, tweeted to me, you were cool in Paris. I knew you were all right, and you don't hate women. And it was the best compliment I've ever gotten in my life. I've been trying to figure out how to multiply it, because she tweeted it at me, and I don't know how to get it more public on Twitter without retweeting it, which looks pathetic, I'm assured. So I'm just realizing I can do it on your podcast, man. And you have lots of listeners.
You can.
No, Courtney Love said, I don't hate women. It was the nicest thing anyone ever said to me. And as far as I can figure out, it's true.
And she said it publicly, which means you could use that as a blurb on your next book.
I could actually. And my next book is about my mother and about why I don't hate women. It literally is. I'm actually writing a memoir about my parents and how their weird ways that they died, because I'm 64, and Montaigne, the great French essayist, tells me I have to prepare to die. Yeah. And in doing so, I'm thinking a lot about how they died and what I learned from it. So I won't go on, because I know we're going over time, but just that our parents teach us how to walk and talk and eat off a fork, but they also teach us to die if we're lucky enough to have parents that died with some degree of, I don't know what, grace or something. And my parents did, 30 years apart, unusual deaths. And so that's what the book's about. But I'm realizing that it's really about a love letter to my mom. And that was partly through my agent saying, women read books, John, and you're telling me that this relationship with your mother was critical to you becoming a writer, critical to everything about you. And I had an early chapter that was about my dad. He said, you got to move your mom up. And it was the one change I made that made so much sense. It made way more sense anyway. My mom was the one I knew. My dad was a training surgeon. I didn't know him until I was a teenager. So it made so much more sense, just chronologically, psychologically, emotionally. So I find, I'm writing, day after day, I'm thinking about my mom and what she gave me. I think she gave me, all men, are ambivalent about women. Let's not make this too rosy. I love the fact that Courtney said I don't hate women, but it's only because, because I love them. But, I went through tortured periods as a little boy. I had early crushes at 6 and 7 where, they were unrequited. And so you lay down a base of frustration with women, of not understanding them, feeling they don't understand you, being mad at them, not hating them, but being mad at them, wanting to learn how to win them and so on. So there's a lot of stuff in there, but you could write the memoir you just described because you don't hate women and they like you. And that would come across. I can't say that John Updike didn't hate women, because he kind of said he did. And he was incredibly misogynistic in so much of his writing about them. It's appalling. His sex scenes are all repulsive. You think, dude, did you enjoy this at all?
Yeah.
It's incredible. It's weird.
Yeah. Yesterday, I interviewed a guy, Alex Papadamas, who's a music writer.
I know the name. Absolutely.
He just wrote a book. Here, I'll show you. It's called I don't know if that's backwards for you.
Quantum Criminals. No, it's the right way around. Nice cover.
It is fantastic about Steely Dan. And one of the things we talked about is their relationship with women, which seems, ambiguous at best.
Right. Vexed a little bit. Yes.
Vexed. That's a good word for it. Yeah. Like they're a couple of nerdy teenagers who never got past that. They never figured women out. They never figured out their own sort of relationship with women. I just saw a phone in the corner there.
Yeah, I just had to take a little video of us that we're doing this so that I have it. No, I have it on my memory banks because I don't want to forget that we did this. I had to visually represent it.
I didn't
I
know if that was a
literally
symbol, like you're saying, I gotta go,
no, no,
dude.
no, great, great. I'm so glad you brought it up. I wasn't sure it was in frame, but yeah, no, I just held my phone up to capture you and me. I did it to Alan Alda too. When Alan he interviewed me on Zoom for my last book, and yeah, I did that as well, and it also threw him off. So anyway,
Alan Alda, Alan Alda, talk about male role models.
Yeah.
Hawkeye Pierce was an important male role model for me. Like that
Yeah.
show was the early MASH, the first 5-6 seasons were probably, from 10 to 15 in my age. You're 3 years older than me. So
yeah, so I wasn't actually watching it at
yeah,
that stage. Yeah.
but I mean, he was a guy who loved women.
Yeah,
Hawkeye
totally.
Pierce, and I think Alan Alda, I think they're pretty similar characters.
Yeah.
A rebellious, but with tact and quality and humor, and
Yes.
like that was an interesting character to grow up with. Hawkeye Pierce.
Yes.
A lot of people.
He was ahead of his time, Alan, and was
Yeah.
jeered at by a lot of right wingers for his, hugging males and stuff. I think he might have invented the male hug practically in a movie that Donna and I were watching that he made back in the 70s. The men are always, sort of ostentatiously hugging each other, which made people uncomfortable back in the day. Now everyone does it.
Yeah.
Well,
yeah, and his Alan relationship with Trapper John, his tent mate on MASH. Well, you said you didn't watch it, but that was a love story. They loved each other, those two guys, and they saved lives together.
Yeah. No,
Yeah.
I do know the feel of that show because I started watching some reruns later, but I was not in the first go round.
Right.
Alan's a great guy and fascinating dude, but he was ahead of his time. I mean, he had these attitudes, frankly, along with guys like Phil Donahue, before they became the dominant ones of our culture.
Jimmy Carter. Like Alan Alda and Jimmy Carter were kind of like peaking at the same time in American culture. Two sensitive, highly intelligent, decent men,
right.
Who had a post-Mailer, post-Updike embodiment of masculinity, which was much more respectful to women, much more sort of integrating their own feminine energy. And I think we need to go back
love
to
Updike. I love Updike, but I got to say, he was the more invidious writer because the sort of misogyny is a little buried and hidden. Someone like Norman, what I'm loving about reading Mailer is he's just out there. Nothing's hidden. He's not a sensitive male in the sense that we would say Alan Alda was, but he's incredibly sensitive. You realize as you once you get past the bluster, this is all about being an intensely, exquisitely sensitive and smart and really at bottom decent individual. But he lets him, to your point, he kind of lets himself freewheelingly be out there, unafraid. Like people will be smart enough to, at the end of the day, if they finish the book, realize I don't need to be hung up in the village square for being a terrible person. Yeah. And, I mean, if there's anything that's annoying about these days is that we are all fearing that that's going to happen to us if we're not careful. And no one wants to have to be careful all the time.
Well, and I feel
just to return to it.
Getting back to Christopher Hitchens, I feel like that's a denial of death. It's a denial of our own mortality to take this shit so seriously. Like we should really embrace the liberation. You talk about Montaigne talking about how you should always be preparing for death. I think one of the values of that is it gives you this liberation to do what you need to do and not fucking worry about the repercussions.
Boy, is that ever true?
You don't want to hurt people, but like for what's coming back at you, who gives a shit? I'll be out of here in 10 years, 20 years at the most,
Right.
I don't get, it's like, I feel like at our age, we should like start smoking cigarettes. I mean, why the fuck not?
No, I know. And you and I have privately talked about how, and I'm married, so I can't do anything about this, but at our age too, all of a sudden, all the 20 somethings and young 30 something girls want to be your very close friend. I have never seen anything like it in New York. Like I can't go to Tony Paratay's East Village Red Room KGB monthly events.
Opium den.
opium because they're bursting with young women.
Yeah.
And I say all this with total humor and affection. It is the greatest experience of my life. I am making friends now with what a woman cast me in a little half-hour movie that I met through Tony. She was 27 at the time. Now she's 30. Wonderful girl, Indigo Bates from England. She moved to New
Indigo
York.
Bates.
And what a great name, eh? Indigo
and
Bates.
Tecumseh Fisk. I mean,
Finch. Aren't these great names?
And do you know Tecumseh? You know who Tecumseh was, right?
I do, absolutely.
And the guy's a linguist? Are you kidding me?
I know. Fabulous stuff, right? It's amazing. No, and it's fun too, because I'm writing this memoiristic thing, and I found it through my mom's family, which I dug back. And actually, my grandfather did it first, but one of my ancestors fought with Tecumseh in the War of 1812 as a United Empire loyal. He came from England, went to America. As the war started to heat up, he decided he was loyal to the crown, and went up to Canada and fought with natives and Tecumseh. So he was they were friends.
Oh, I'm confusing. I thought Tecumseh was the Cherokee who invented the written language for the Cherokee.
There might be another Tecumseh. I wouldn't be surprised.
I could really.
You never know. Who knows? It turns out to be a very popular name. Maybe it's a popular native name. I don't know. This was a Tecumseh that was a warrior that was fighting the American incursion into Canada.
Oh, okay. I'm thinking of somebody.
And was buddies with my ancestor, apparently.
Huh.
Boy, we've tangentially spiraled. Is that bad or is that good?
No, it's good. That's what we do. That's what we do here. All right. Well, we're not really going to have time to talk about trans. Maybe that was your plan all along, right? I was
just going to say, I wonder if I did that deliberately.
I'm just gonna,
oh my God.
Let's talk about prostitution for 2 hours and to avoid the dangerous stuff, right?
Yeah, exactly. My God. I mean, if I'm willing to go into the danger of befriending 20-something girls publicly when I'm a married man, I'm clearly really scared of transgender that I won't even go there.
Yeah,
that's a clusterfuck. But
I listened to the podcast with
J.K. Rowling one.
Fantastic,
fascinating.
Yeah.
No, I realized I had to, just in case I ended up in interviews like this very one where I've actually sidestepped it. But I realized I had to. At least educate myself on it. And interesting as hell. My one sentence take would be, I think J.K. Rowling should have probably just kept her mouth shut on all this, to be honest with you. I don't think she did herself any favors. I'm not sure she's doing feminism any favors, but maybe I'm wrong. I don't know.
Yeah, I'm persuaded by her point that there are women without a platform who are being screwed for saying women aren't the same as trans women 100%. And someone needs to sort of, take incoming fire for them. They're getting fired from their jobs. They're getting canceled. They're getting destroyed for daring to say that, maybe a woman's rape shelter is not a place for a biological man.
Right. But it's funny, if you peel it back as far as I had to when I wrote that book about the sex change child, now it may be that some people are changing sex out of peer pressure or because it's trendy. But, what I learned about when I did that book 20 years ago was people whose, their brain centers and their nervous systems had developed a sexual orientation and gender identity that was in contrast to what their genitals were.
Sure.
And there's nothing unusual about hermaphroditism. There's nothing unusual about people developing differently than what their outward sexual. We know that because there's something in the world called homosexuals that have a sexual orientation that's, for their same-sex partner, which is, against what the biological setup is supposed to be. So there is indisputably people whose brain centers and nervous systems have differentiated to be female, but they look male. So when J.K. Rowling talks about people that are actually men, she doesn't know what the fuck she's talking about, and unless she's actually studied each and every individual case to know that she's not talking about one of these people who has a female brain.
Yeah.
So why is that not a female? What is she? Is she the person that's putting so much attention and importance on the penis? Because that's a shame too.
Yeah, that's a fair point. Although I think, her point would be, I believe in the UK, the law is if you say you're a woman, you're a woman. There's no therapy, there's no hormone therapy, there's no surgery required. You can just, oh, I'm getting arrested. Well, I'm a woman, so send me to the woman's prison. I
That
agree 100%. There's a great book to throw another one at you called Conundrum by
oh, of course, yeah,
you know
Jan
that book,
Morris.
Jan Morris.
Oh
I
yeah,
mean, that's
yeah,
clearly what you're talking about. Someone
100%.
whose body was just out of alignment with her being from the get-go. And
Yeah,
yeah, there are certainly people like that. But I mean, shouldn't there be, you're a woman who's just been raped, and your bunk mate is a 6'4", 240-pound girl who was a boy until a week ago, and what about her rights?
right, right.
It's a tough.
No, I know.
I mean, I don't expect you to have any answers. I certainly don't have any
Yeah,
answers, but I do feel like,
yeah,
this whole like trans women are women. It's like, I feel like it's a larger question about nuance and our
hmm
unwillingness to acknowledge that there are situations that are simply unresolvable, irresolvable, or whatever the proper word is there, down to like basics. Like these situations are so nuanced and so complex that it's like saying, well, a Yoruba person who's an albino is a white person. And it's like, well, you're looking at one factor
yeah,
and saying
yes,
that means everything else lines up, and it doesn't, and
yeah, yeah,
I feel like maybe, there was a famous essay, the sort of the paranoid style in American thinking or
yes,
thought, or like some
yes.
famous John Maynard Keynes or somebody like that. Um, and I feel like American thought also has sort of a lust for inappropriate simplicity. Like, we want to boil it down to basics. What's the bottom line? Like,
Yeah,
time
yeah,
is money. Like,
yes,
and
yeah,
it's just like life isn't like
yes.
that. It doesn't conform.
It doesn't conform, and we're going into an amazing uh, period. I don't know. I mean, all I know is it's funny, when I wrote that book, in some ways I feel quietly responsible for a lot of what's happening. And luckily I'm not being fingered for it. But my book was a very passionate take on this little boy that was, a developmentally normal little boy, born completely normally, lost his penis in a circumcision accident. When he was 2 years old, he was converted supposedly to girlhood. His testicles were removed at Johns Hopkins. He was scheduled for hormone treatment when he reached puberty, but he knew all along that he was a male. So he felt like a transsexual girl would feel that wanted to be a man. But his biology, because he had developed quote unquote normally for a male, he was an XY male. He had a male orientation and gender identity, and changing his body as a little baby didn't make any difference at all. It was reported as a big success in the medical literature. That was a lie. It was a scandalous fraud. And it eventually came out many years later. And I wrote a book about it. The guy who I met, I was the only journalist in the world that did. And, my sort of, I was so sort of galvanized by the story of him, but also hermaphrodites that I met, intersex people that I met, that had also grown up with a gender identity, sometimes sexual orientation, but sometimes not. Those are sometimes out of alignment. But anyway, it didn't fit what their body was. And these were people that desperately needed to be listened to now, because they'd been intervened on surgically when they were babies. So I sort of thought, boy, this is kind of the last frontier of like activism that we need to get behind to stop the surgeries on babies, so that when the person's at least able to say how they feel, they must be listened to. Because and when you start to speak up tends to be when the hormones hit in puberty. So, we've got this moment now, this very charged moment, where parents are being attacked and doctors are being attacked for listening to teenagers. about their feelings of not being the sex that they are. And my book was very much saying, listen to them and act appropriately. Now, it's actually funny because my book did say, let's hold off irreversible hormonal and surgical interventions until we're really sure. So I was talking about them in babyhood, but now we've moved the goalposts up to teen years. And I guess I hadn't articulated this before, but yeah, I would say let's keep that idea in mind. Let's hold off until we're sure, because I do understand the argument that, oh, I hope I don't get killed for this. Teenage years are years of incredible peer pressure, but also just kind of throbbing with the peer, mind meld, like the kids that commit suicide when one kid does, and there's a rash of them. Like there's some way in which, you're that young and you're just vibrating with your fellow young souls that are changing. And so these kids can be legit, I think, confused, maybe.
Sure. And also, aside from the peer thing, you're trying on different identities.
100%.
So why 100%. Not try on the opposite sex identity, right? I mean,
absolutely.
I was convinced until I was 15 that I was a Native American, that I was an Iroquois who was born spirit in the wrong body, wrong family, wrong suburbs. I wandered around the neighborhood when I was 11, 12, 13 years old in a loincloth. I mean, I came home from school, I put on my loincloth.
That was fabulous.
Yeah.
Wow. Have you told that story before? That's great.
Oh, yeah. I told that story. I've fessed up to it. Yeah.
It's fantastic.
Sure. John, no, but, I could talk to you all fucking day, dude. No, I mean, I
know that's the problem.
I don't want to take your time. I just want to say, I hope you will write a memoir at some point about, because we've talked about two experiences that you've had as a journalist that are both like globally fascinating, like that get, you have been witness to some, and I'm sure we haven't even scratched the surface. I don't know about your whole, journalistic career and the other. I know you were at Rolling Stone and you were like singing for Jan Wenner. And I mean, like, I only know half a dozen things, and I doubt that you've pulled out the half a dozen most interesting things that you've ever done and just, sprinkled them. I think it would be so interesting to have a first person account of what it was like to go and meet these people and witness these things. And,
I may end up doing it. This memoiristic thing I'm writing now is kind of, I've got the camera trained towards my parents for the most part, but I have to write about myself because their influence on me. Yeah. And I do sort of come to New York in the story and land some of these stories, but yeah, that's not the focus. And if this book works, maybe someone will want the book that you're describing, or maybe I'll just feel like I want to do it. Yeah.
It's not enough that I want it, John.
It is.
Aren't I your ideal reader?
100%, man. No, you've actually given me the idea. I'm going to start making notes right after we get off this podcast. No, it's a cool idea.
Hey, dude. Yeah. It's like one of my only regrets in life is that we don't live in the same place and we can't go out and do this every week. It
would be terrifying because we'd be drinking all the time, never getting home. We would just be in trouble. Then real trouble would start.
I stopped drinking in September, and
brilliant.
And I don't miss it at all. I mean, it wasn't like a big deal. I got COVID and my liver tests were kind of weird, and the doctor's like, you should take a couple of months off, and I did, and I just never got back to it. And it's like, it also, thanks to the New Yorker, I was about a month into not drinking, and I read this article in the New Yorker about the new non-alcoholic beer technology
written by my friend John Seabrook, who's in a band that we're in now called the Sequoias. Yes, I know
Sequoia. Sequoia was the guy who invented the written language for the Cherokee. That's nice. Tecumseh and Sequoia. I got them mixed up.
Fantastic.
Anyway. Give him my.
Yeah, you're not drinking.
I'm drinking this athletic IPA that he talked about in the article, and it's fantastic. And I realized I was never into the alcohol buzz anyway. I just liked the taste of beer.
Oh, wow.
And so now I drink that stuff, and I'm like, yeah, that's good. I just had a beer and I'm fine. And I never got drunk on beer anyway. I just got fat and sluggish.
Well, the The drinking thing, I know we have to stop, but I took it off drinking for 6 months a year and a half ago. And that's when I dreamed up this entire idea for this memoir. I had just finished a book. I was exhausted. I thought, I'm not writing another book for I don't know how long. And I suddenly found myself so full of new energy because I wasn't getting boozed every night.
Mm.
And I don't know, whatever else was going on in my brain from not getting pissed. I was suddenly dreaming up this whole book and the whole structure for. Anyway, it's good to not drink, I have to say.
Yeah.
That's good. No wonder you look so healthy. You look fabulous. No homo, as they say.
Although that's probably offensive now, right? Like you
I
can't
know.
say that.
I just boldly said it. It's tangentially speaking. It's a podcast. I can say that type of thing. Damn it.
A little homo, just a little.
a little homo. Exactly.
My partner's father is gay, and he's our age. He's a New York Broadway producer. He's not flamboyant. He's, you wouldn't know he's gay unless it came up in conversation. But we had a really weird conversation one time. Because he's my kind of dude, he's just a cool guy, really funny, super smart, doesn't give a shit. Like he'll say whatever it is, and that's how I am, and that's how you are, and I think that's what bonds us. But we're having this conversation. It was me, him, and his daughter, and my partner Anya, and we're in a little East Village brunch spot on a Sunday, so it's packed, and everybody. And he had just read Sex at Dawn, and he's like, I thought it was so interesting, and I'd love to like make a stage production. Like, what do you think? How could we do this? And we start talking about like, could we stage like a group sex thing on, and how would that work? And then I was like, as a gay guy, like I've always envied you. Like when you're in a group sex situation, you're at least potentially attracted to everyone in the room. As a straight guy, half the people in the room, like, not only am I not attracted to them, like I'm kind of repulsed. Like I don't really want to I don't even want to go to a sauna with dudes, like I don't want dicks around me. And we're talking about that. And then we get into, and meanwhile, Anya's not saying a word. And she's normally very, in the conversation, she's just sitting there. And later she's told me, she's like, that was just the weirdest thing. Like you and my dad talking about sex so openly. Yes. And then he says, what you referred to earlier, he said, Chris, like one of the biggest surprises in my life was, I thought as I got older, availability would evaporate and nobody would want to be with me because now I'm, old and flabby, but there are all these young guys who just want to be with an older man. And it's like, I've never had so much opportunity. And I said, dude, it's the same being straight. And I sort of gestured toward his daughter. Right. And it's just like the conversation stops. There's this like moment where all of us are like, uh-oh, that might have been too much.
Oh yeah, there finally is. But you're like me. I'm always seeking like that one step too far.
Right.
And it sounds like you got there.
No, I didn't, because there was the moment. There was the beat, and then he reaches across the table and high fives me.
Nice. Oh, he's a good dad. That's awesome.
Dad. He's awesome.
He's a cool guy.
Yeah.
Fascinating. Well, we're going through a daddy moment. I don't know what it is. But daddies are suddenly, I don't know. There's no generation gap anymore. I don't think it was like this. Oh, maybe it was back in the 60s. Who knows?
I'll tell you what, I think a lot of it relates to what we were saying earlier. Guys who grew up with the sort of David Foster Wallace mentality are not attractive to women.
Oh, 100%. I was literally just talking to a 27-year-old that was telling me that. Oh my God, that's
They're
right.
Like, I want a man who's not ashamed to be a man.
Yep.
Not
God,
an
they're
asshole,
actually saying it.
Not abusive, but someone who's comfortable in his skin, knows what he is. It is not like, you mentioned the male gaze earlier. I had a Spanish girlfriend years ago, and we moved to San Francisco. She was 20 years old, beautiful, beautiful Spanish girl. And one day I came home from work and she was in tears. I said, what's wrong? And she said, it was this whole like nothing, we did that for a while. And then finally she said, men don't look at me here. I'm ugly. I said, you're not ugly. You're beautiful. What do you mean? She's like, I walk down the street. No one looks at me. No one talks to me. It's like, baby, look, first of all, you're in America. we're not allowed to do that here. Secondly, you're in San Francisco. All the dudes are gay. So they're not like, this is not about you. You're not
Yes.
unattractive. This is
Yeah.
culture, And so the male gaze, like, of course it can be abused. Of course it can be creepy, but it
Yeah.
can also be vitalizing. It can be beautiful. It can be like, women, I don't want to speak for women, but women I know like to be desired in a tasteful
Yeah.
way,
Yeah. Yeah. No, I know.
So yeah, I
Well,
think that's a big issue. The whole sort of like we're what's the word? Castrating, culturally castrating young men. And it's
I wouldn't
having
even have known it
negative
if I wasn't
effects.
hearing it from the horse's mouth. I'm hearing it from young women. No, I know. Yeah,
Yeah.
they're actually finding guys way too nervous, and it's wacky.
Well, that's the motivation for writing this erotic memoir, for those young guys to read it and be like, oh, I'm not, I mean, all my writing is to try to tell people it's not their fault. They're not as sick as they think they've been told they are. It's the culture who's, warping your mind. And so I do kind of feel like that's the motivation. Like, you can love women and also be confused by them, just as they're confused by you. So,
Nice.
yeah. John,
Sounds awesome. Dude, this was so fun, needless to say. I mean,
you're,
when do you get to go on a podcast and it's just like, I don't know, it's just like really, I've done a lot of Zoom interviews.
yeah.
This was like the Nate plus ultra. It's
Well,
just so fun
see, I feel like
and interesting.
I'm at a point in my podcast career. I've been doing this over a decade now. And I'm like, the Zoom interviews were necessary during COVID. And now I'm living in a tiny little town in the middle of nowhere. So, it's that. But if I'm going to talk on Zoom, I want it to be either about a subject I'm super interested in, like Steely Dan, or with a person I really enjoy engaging with, so that all the encumbrances aren't a big problem,
Yeah. Yeah. No, well,
So,
it's brilliant. I felt like I was in a room with you, so that was really great.
but you didn't have to smell my farts. It's the best of both worlds, man. But I can. I mean, that's important too.
There you go.
All right, I'm going to
Absolutely.
stop recording.